I'm Dr. Mollie Marti, and welcome to Resiliency Matters. This is where we take the big resiliency research and best practices and break it down into small bite-sized pieces that you can begin using immediately to strengthen yourself and others. What if you could come to better understand teenagers? Would you spend the next 28 minutes with us? Would you spend the next 8 minutes with us if you could get tips to help teens grow a healthy sense of self? Who is us? The other half of us today is Dr. Daniel Lapsley, chair of the Notre Dame Department of Psychology and director of the Moral and Adolescent Psychology Lab. Dan is a well-published author, his own books. He's edited and contributed to over 100 articles and book chapters, and he is a very well-respected expert in developing healthy adolescents, teens, into young adults. And we are so very happy you're here with us. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Mollie. I'm very glad to be here. Thanks.
So, as I say, you're an expert, as far as I see it, in developing kids into healthy adulthood, and it's always good to kind of know where we're headed. So let's start with the working definition. What is healthy adulthood?
Well, I think a healthy adult is someone who is able to manage their own affairs, who has a sense of independence from their parents and family of origin, who is capable of intimate relations without feeling smothered by them, so without being overwhelmed by them. So I think a competent adult is one who is resilient, who has a sense of self about the truth of their lives, and are capable of living well the life that is good for one to live.
And hearing that as a parent, I think, yeah, that's what I want for my kids, and that's what we want for all kids. So that's very helpful to have that definition. You have a recent article that I devoured. I just emailed you and told you I devoured that. And in that, you share a wonderful quote about mobilizing resources to meet and match the moment of hope available in young people. I love that.
Yeah, I love that too. I'm quoting Donald Winnicott, who was a very famous child psychologist from a few decades ago. And the quote is really wonderful because it illustrates for Winnicott how adults can help young people meet their aspirations. You know, when he refers to the moment of hope, you know, a lot of young people, you know, they have aspirations for themselves, and they're not always realistic, and sometimes there are illusions about themselves. There's a sense of grandeur about their place in the world in the future as they think about their future life. And Winnicott argued it'd be good for adults and parents to play with that and mirror back to young people their own sense of grandeur about the world and their place in it. So that's one sense in which I mean the term. Another sense is that I think transitions are always new opportunities for young people to reinvent themselves. So the transition from childhood to adolescence is one important transition. Going from adolescence to young adulthood is another. You know, so these are opportunities for kids to reappraise the kinds of people they claim themselves to be, what their aspirations are, what their skills are, what their friends are. They get to change their peer reputation. They get to find new cliques, new groups, develop new competencies. And I think what schools can do and families can do is to provide what I call in the article you refer to, opportunities for ordinary magic. You know, ordinary magic is simply being affirming, being the one good relationship for that young person as they remake themselves.
And I love that. I want to repeat that tip because I know a lot of our viewers can be in that overwhelm of raising teens, and they're looking at the change and the transitions and the demands. And I hear you calling them to say, take a step back, because when you have change and transitions, there is hope, there is opportunities.
Right. Yeah, so every transition is an opportunity to make a step forward and change. And I'm not one who believes that any particular phase of the lifespan is destiny. You know, it's not early childhood. That doesn't set you on a pathway that you can't change, nor is adolescence. Most of the time, as we grow older, there'll be many opportunities to change our personalities, to change our aspirations, to change our identity, to change our relationships. So I think there's many opportunities throughout the life course where we can change. You know, we're in dynamic interaction with changing contexts as we change jobs, change relationships, change schools, and these provide new opportunities to change ourselves.
Change yourselves. Okay, so we as parents, I think, intuitively know that our kids are not growing up in the same world that we grew up in even 3, 4, or 5 decades ago. Certainly not the world that our parents grew up in. So what is different about coming of age today in today's modern society?
Well, that's a big question, and in fact, I see this in my students at Notre Dame a lot. You know, they're not growing up in the same ecology I did at all. In fact, in some ways, becoming an adult is more difficult in a way. It's more difficult in the sense that the signposts of what counts as an adult are changing. There may be a new developmental phase emerging right before our very eyes. You know, there used to be some known stepping stones by how one got from adolescence to adulthood. For example, you graduated from high school, you went to college, you graduated from college, you got married, you got your first job, then you got married. So there seemed to have been some expectable stairway from adolescence to adulthood. I don't think that's quite the case anymore. I think what is happening now is we are expecting young people, by young people here I mean college-age students, young adults, to work on multiple developmental challenges simultaneously. And so I think this is harder. You know, it's harder when you're in school to also think about your career, but also your sense of intimacy in relationships. And so we're now asking people to sort out issues of intimacy and issues of identity simultaneously. And that was not the expectation decades ago. You know, the expectation decades ago was work on identity first, know who you are, and then form a relationship. But now I think we've accelerated that, extended the transition to adulthood, and so in that sense it's harder.
And researchers have actually are adding a stage of life called emerging adulthood.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of consensus about this now, that right before our very eyes, a new phase of the lifespan is emerging. So emerging adults are individuals between, say, 18 and 25. These are individuals who are not adolescents. They do exercise autonomy over wide parts of their lives. They are independent, but not completely independent. They're, for example, dependent on their parents financially. They don't necessarily feel like an adult. They have gone through the transitions. They've graduated from high school, and they're maybe have taken their first job, but they're in college and they don't feel like they're quite adults yet. So they're in this netherworld between not quite adults, not quite financially autonomous, dependent on their parents in some respects, but autonomous over many other arenas of their life. So it's a new life phase emerging right before us.
So let's back up to helping adolescents and teens develop a strong sense of self, a healthy sense of self, because that positions them to better get to that autonomous stage. And we have some tips that we're going to put up online or on the camera here. So can you walk us through these?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that one must do to develop a sense of self is to experience success in domains of importance. This goes back to William James. William James used to argue that your healthy self-worth is when you had a lot of successes that matches your pretensions or your aspirations. But what we have learned in research now is it depends on your domains of importance. You don't have to be good in everything, but be good in experience some success in some domains that are important to you. So that's the first thing. The second one is to develop a situation where you have positive appraisal from others. In other words, what you're doing is valued by people who are important to you and reflect that back to you. So sometimes that might mean identifying arenas where you get more positive appraisal. So if you're in a peer group, for example, where you're not getting that appraisal, you change peer groups. Become emotionally close family relationships that respect the individuality of the child. In fact, what we know is that emotionally close relationships are a good arena for developing independence in children. Avoid behaviors that intrude, exploit, or manipulate children. Psychologically over-controlling parents probably impede positive development. Provide structure and make demands for maturity with openness and warmth. This is one of the great tips we have for positive parenting. Good parents provide structure and maturity demands, but they do it in the context of warmth and responsiveness. And finally, asking questions and tolerating differences is a way of enabling young people to explore their individuality, their own ideas, their own sense of independence.
So there is so much wealth of knowledge in that, and so that's why I wanted to put that up on the screen. Let's wrap up this segment with a takeaway tool, and your tool is helping teens grow a healthy sense of self, lays the foundation for healthy adulthood. So what has the greatest impact on youth development, nature or nurture? Stay tuned to find out. Hi, I'm Dr. Mollie Marti, and welcome back to Resiliency Matters. Today we are visiting with Dr. Daniel Lapsley from the University of Notre Dame. Dan is an expert in child development, and we were just putting up some rules, or some rules of thumb. We're going to talk more about some of those this segment. But that dynamic, and it is a tricky, creative dynamic of holding too tight, letting go too much. I was just, as you know, with a community that is mourning the loss of a 14-year-old to suicide. And one of the parents, one of the questions that came up after we talked about the warning signs, she said, how do I know that these warning signs are there? Because my son is a teen, and so he's stepped away from me, and I can't really be watching what he's doing. You can tell me if I'm right or wrong in my response. My response was that teens take a natural step away as they're developing their autonomy, and that most parents, many parents, I don't think most, but many parents take that as a cue that they should take a step back. And my suggestion for the parents in the audience was, let that teen take the step, but you stay there, because it feels like your child doesn't need you anymore, but they really do need that stability and connection.
I agree completely with your answer. I would just urge parents to understand that when young adolescents are making movements towards autonomy, it's not a breaking away from the family. That just does not happen as often as people think it is. It's not. I would say, as one of the mythic qualities of we think of adolescence, that normal striving for autonomy is not rejection of the family. And so children will become more interior, more introspective. They'll want more privacy. They will try to engage in behaviors outside of the family. And so that looks like a young person turning their back on their family. It is not. It is normal part of adolescent development. That should be encouraged. But I like your response, is that that's not a cue to step away either. In fact, teenagers do better in their autonomy striving when parents continue to monitor their behavior and stay engaged in their lives as much as they ever did. But it's not a turning away. It's not a cause for concern.
And you had a great quote in your article that I wrote down, because it was a little stabbed to my heart, because if I tend to go one way or the other, I'm too close to the kids, or I'm too, I'm not the type of parent to just step back, throw up my hands, and I'm involved. And so you write, in poorly differentiated families, the emerging autonomy striving of the adolescent is almost seen as a betrayal of the family. Yeah. And I love that. I could just hear, or a sitcom going, oh, what are you doing to your mother? Don't you love me, right? But this is really a great mirror for parents who have been taking it personally to say, oh, my kid will have nothing to do with me. Yeah,
in poorly differentiated families, I think parents are very much invested in their role and identity as being a parent. And so the autonomy striving of adolescence it causes parents to revisit their own identity, their own role they play in the lives of their child. And so it looks like they don't need us anymore. And so it's a kind of a threat to their own identity. Well-differentiated families give teenagers room to breathe, to explore new things, to make mistakes. They provide a structure but they understand that teenagers can have their own point of view. They can have their own view on the world, and they might enjoy things that maybe the parents aren't comfortable with. In poorly differentiated families, however, growing up is treated as a betrayal. It's treated as you can't have your own point of view. Your role in my life is to be what I am as your parent. You have my attitudes, my political philosophies, my view in the world. And so individuation goes more poorly in families that are poorly differentiated.
And I tell you, nothing can get a parent there faster than having a child go off to college. That was a great learning experience for me, to really be taking a look at You know, am I ready to let go? How does this look?
Right.
You have, because some of this process, you said there will be some conflict that comes up, and you also provide kind of these rules of thumb for parents to help manage this conflict.
Yeah, between 12 and 14, there's probably more conflict in the family than over childhood rate, so parents notice it, you know, so they look at their family and they say, oh, there's more conflict in the family, but in fact, a lot of it is normal, a lot of it's related with puberty. And my advice to parents in managing conflict in the family comes down to 3 tips. There's really just 3 kinds of rules, I think, that we have to worry about in families. There are rules that are moral rules. Moral rules are things that will never change. You don't take votes to change them. They're applied across the world universally. And so I think a parent should articulate the moral rules, hold fast to those values, and not negotiate them. And then there's all kinds of rules that are called conventional rules, and they govern all the aspects that make family life efficient. I mean, who takes out the chores? What about staying on the phone too long? And what about rules about dating? What's the curfew? You know, so these are things that can be negotiated. My rule of thumb here is negotiate those rules. Then there's a whole personal domain where adolescents want to carve out some domain of discretion, some arena where it's only their choice. And so these might be things like what music to like, what friends to choose, what books to read. And so I would say, as conflict arises in a family, let's be sure what kind of rules we're talking about. If it's conventional rules, well, let's negotiate that. If it's moral rules, well, let's articulate and defend them. But I would give, my advice to parents would give wide latitude to the personal domain. You might not like their love of hip-hop music or whatever it is, but you know, you have to let them go. In my own life, it was Bob Dylan. My parents could not understand why I could possibly love Bob Dylan as much as I did, but they let me do it, you know? So it's my arena of discretion. Now, this doesn't solve all the problems, you know, because I think parents, they want to have a larger moral domain than children can live with, you know? And I think kids want to have a larger personal domain. Than what parents can live with, you know. So this doesn't solve all the problems, but I think it at least provides an occasion for conversation about things in the family.
Certainly, and boundaries and expectations and a starting place, as you say. Okay, so we've been talking about parent-child, and all of these apply to youth builders and mentors and people with interaction with kids. But you also do a lot of work looking at a broader context of schools. And you look at that environment and the fit with the child. And there's a lot of things that schools can be doing right. If they do it right, it increases resiliency, and the opposite is true as well. So.
Well, psychologists have for a long time worried about the structure of junior high schools and whether that facilitates or impedes normal development. There's inflammatory ways of describing that. They'll say, well, developmental casualties pile up in the 7th grade. And in fact, they do. So a lot of young people have done well in elementary school, make the school transition to 7th grade to the junior high school, and hit a wall. You know, so they're not doing well in school, their grades plummet, and you know, and sometimes some kids never recover from that. So there's a lot of research over the last decade or so worrying about whether the structure of schools, that the environments we create for young adolescents, in fact meet their developmental needs or not. And I think the judgment is no, they don't. You know, we put kids in environments where they're not just junior, smaller versions of high school kids. They have unique early developmental needs that require new educational environments. And that sparked the middle school movement. The middle school movement was supposed to be a corrective to the junior high school model. So the junior high school so the middle school model was to assure that young people's friendship networks are not broken up unduly just at a time when they need them most. It encouraged pedagogies where that de-emphasize competitive grading and social comparison, because that's a developmental issue that young people are facing right now. They want to know, am I liked? Do people like me? Where do I stand in my peer group? So we don't want to have teaching practices that exacerbate that. You know, so, and we want to make sure, one final point on this, is that we want to make sure young people know an adult well. In junior high schools, that's unlikely to happen. But in a middle school model, if you have team teaching and other kinds of block scheduling, it maximizes the opportunities for an adult to get to know a child well and vice versa. Just when they need it, just when they're exploring identities and maybe pushing the envelope on some things.
And that maps on the T in our Thrive model is trusted adults.
Trusted
and
adults,
it maps right on. I'm eating this up. I hope you viewers are. And I'm going to spell it out for you because we've been talking about individuals and context and nature and nurture. And the answer isn't or, it's both. It's nature and nurture. So tool number 2, raising a healthy child requires a holistic approach that honors the inner dynamics of both nature and nurture. What's normal, what's abnormal, some myth busting about teenagers. Coming up, you don't want to miss it. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Dr. Mollie Marti, and welcome back to Resiliency Matters. I'm here today with Dr. Daniel Lapsley from the University of Notre Dame Department of Psychology. We promised our viewers some myth busting, and there's plenty of myths to bust around the concepts of adolescents and teenagers and what's really going on. What's the biggest myth in your experience?
Well, if you ask me what the biggest myth about adolescence is that it's a normal period of turmoil. It's a normal period of storm and stress. I think psychologists in the early 20th century have traumatized a generation of parents into fearing the oncoming adolescence of their children. If you ask a middle school teacher, if you ask someone what grade they teach and they said middle school, everyone looks sorrowful for them, like this is the big thing, like, oh, how could you possibly do that? I think the biggest myth is that it's normal to expect a lot of conflict. It's normal to expect that your child becomes a different person. It's normal to expect a lot of turmoil and emotional upset. Identity work will be a crisis, and these are myths. These are things that are not true.
Okay.
For most adolescents are not true.
So you shared some research, some myth busting. We're going to put some tips up on the camera and talk through those. So walk us through your first point about what research really shows.
So research shows that personality is continuous from early childhood on. You know, the way you are as a child is not completely different from the way you were as a young toddler. The way you were as an adolescent can be predicted from what you were like as a child, and so on. The way you're like as a young adult can be predicted from the way you were as an adolescent. There are important continuities in development, in personality. So change is continuous, and there's important continuities from early life on.
So if there's a parent going, oh no, my daughter or son's going to be a teenager, just relax,
yeah,
Mom.
Just relax,
Dad. Okay, because they're not going to just flip a switch and be a different person overnight.
They're not.
How about emotional stability or instability?
Yeah,
what does the research show?
So most teens are emotionally stable. One statistic that I like to use in my class is to say that about 20% of adolescents are resilient. They don't show any overt signs of difficulty or upset. They're the invulnerables. About 60% have occasional upsets, but not serious enough to disrupt daily life. And then 20% have a lot of problems. So 1 out of 5. Now, I'm not saying 1 out of 5 is something we should be happy about. We should worry about those kids. But the 20-60-20 also applies to adults. You know, 20% of adults are doing just fine. 60% of adults have occasional upsets, the blues or stress or anxieties, but not serious enough to disrupt daily life. And 20% should probably see professional help. You know, so 20-60-20 applies both to adolescents and to adults. So that indicates that adolescence is not a time of unique developmental or psychopathological challenge. They enjoy mental health in the same degree, in the same way as adults do.
So let's talk about that 20%, those troubled kids. What does that look like?
Yeah, so 1 out of 5 is something we should worry about as a society. But there's things we know about those groups that make that we can identify them as being somewhat different from the 60%, for example, who show normal upset. You know, that's a natural question to ask. I think there are 3 criteria by which we can distinguish the 20% who are really having a hard time versus the 60% who have occasional upset. One is the kids who are having a hard time show a greater quantity of symptoms. Number 2, they show more pervasiveness of symptoms. In other words, at school and home and family and neighborhood. And 3, they've had it for a long time. It dates back to early life, to early childhood. So quantity, pervasiveness, and duration.
It's a great tip. So if you're having a lot of conflict, it's been long-standing, it's not just at home, it's at school, you're seeing it in different contexts.
Yeah, and the worst possible interpretation, that those kids are just going through a phase, you know, when those three things happen. Seek help.
Seek help. Okay, so tool number 3. Relax, we gave you that one. Conflict with teens is a normal part of the process of developing autonomy while maintaining close relationships. We put all of the tips up there on the screen for you. We hope you found this show helpful. This is Dr. Mollie Marti with Resiliency Matters on your local programming leader, Mediacom NC22.